Hello and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview ClimateTech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we have a bit of a different episode. Over the past 2.5 years doing this, we have noticed there is quite a lack of branding across the climate tech companies that we talk to. Not all of them, but there's a good number of people that we bump into that just really are kind of missing the mark when it comes to marketing and branding. This is not exactly surprising, given that a lot of the founders in the space are highly technical and laser focused on their technology. But during Climate Week, I had the chance to attend the Climate Capital Summit hosted by Rick and Simran from Equal Ventures. Now, we've had Rick on the pod recently. And one of the guest speakers was Chris Sacca. And one of his biggest takeaways was that there is not a shortage of capital, but there is a huge shortage of good storytelling in the climate tech space. So with all these factors, we decided to have Anna Konstantinova to talk about branding and marketing advice for climate tech companies. Anna does work with climate tech companies specifically on helping them craft their brand and manage marketing. She's very, very expert at the space, and she's also part of the TTI network as well. She walked us through a few of the major principles you should consider as you build and has some pretty interesting insights generally. In the spirit of collaboration, she has also offered to do a free consultation with our listeners. So if you're looking for some small, digestible starting points, reach out to her and mention the Clean Techies podcast and she'll help you out. We are confident that you will find this valuable, so reach out afterwards with your thoughts. Enjoy the episode.
Impact brands represent the choice to live our lives in alignment with planetary action and our values, to preserve our amazing home for generations to come. Be it through solar panels, how you travel, where you're sourcing your materials, the choices we make matter. And I know you know that if you're listening to this podcast. My name is Anna Konstantinova, and I'm on a mission to make impact brands our next paradigm. I believe that marketing can be used for us rather than against us, and I want to help you build the best brand possible so we can all pour our strength into solving the biggest issue of our time. Whether you're a founder or an investor representing portfolio companies, let's work together to make sure your brand is seen, heard, and remembered the way it deserves to be. And as a thank you to the Clean Techies community, I'm offering 20% off my newest launch, Branding Sessions, with code CLEANTECHIES, one word. We'll take 60 or 90 minutes to solve one specific problem, whether it be a naming issue, strategy development, business growth, or beyond. Let's put our minds together and move forward with renewed energy. Can't wait to hear what you're working on. Find me at annako.co. That's ANNAKO.co. Talk soon.
All right, welcome to the show, Anna. How's it going?
Great. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you. We've obviously connected in person over coffee in Union Square, and glad to be able to have you on and talk about what you're doing today. So let's get into the details. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about your qualifications, and how did you get into climate?
Sure. So I feel like I talked to a lot of people who had a similar trajectory in terms of like they didn't start out as climate. I was actually at dinner last night and we were talking about how when we were in college, like majoring in climate wasn't really a thing. Like I don't know anybody who, past the recent era has been majoring in climate, So I think it's really cool that that's a path now, but that wasn't my path, honestly. I immigrated to the States when I was about 3 years old from Ukraine. And I think advertising helped me assimilate into American culture. I was just seeing all of these things like billboards and TV commercials and things like that. And I was like, wow, somebody came up with something as crazy as Tony the Tiger. And like, people know what that is. And I was like, I can come up with something like wild and crazy. Like if you come up to anybody on the street and say Tony the Tiger, like that's going to make them feel and remember something, and somebody just came up with that. Like, it's totally wild when you think about it. And that's what I wanted to do. Like, I was super attracted to being able to like come up with these cultural objects and shift the way that culture and behavior kind of folds out based on creativity, based on strategy, based on brands. And so I wanted to be in advertising since I was a kid. It was like my North Star for so long. I majored in it.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel.
I followed that path, as deeply as I could. And I ended up working at a couple of agencies here in New York, most recently as the director of strategy. But around like 2016, I started to really get interested in like the entrepreneurship crowd by going to Summit at Sea and things like that. And also realizing how far away from nature we were at the ad agency. I was working for Ford Motor Company at the time. And I feel like, the objective, obviously, at any ad agency is like more sales, more, engagement, more awareness. And at that time, I just started getting a little disillusioned because I was like, I wish that we could lean into being together more, helping the planet more, things like that. And I wasn't really seeing that at the ad agency. So while I was at Ford, I ended up actually co-founding a startup called Second House. And it was all about getting people out of the city and into nature more readily, which was pretty cool. And we had these kind of saloons at Soho House. We called them the Getting Back to Nature series. And I met all these different people who worked in, agriculture, architecture, like all different sectors, but had found a way to get back into nature through their verticals. And that really inspired me, and it made me understand, like, I don't have to work with like the Ford Motor Company guys. You know what I mean? Like, I can do something that's more aligned with the people that I want to be with, and the kind of work that I want to do. So that was kind of the very beginning of what I started to do. And then on the side, I would work with a lot of actually female-based entrepreneurs in impact. But I wasn't calling it then. I was just like, oh, I want to help you out. I want to help you out. And that was some of the foundation for the brand foundational work that I do now. But then in 2020, I was working as the director of strategy at an agency called Terry and Sandy. And I actually ended up getting let go. It was a crazy time. And my good friend, Alessandra Salzberger, the founder of TTI, was like, Anna, you don't really want to like sell sugar to kids in plastic jars anyway. And I was like, you're kind of right, but like, what am I going to do? And she's like, start coming to these TTI meetings, take some time to think about how you can really lean into what you actually want to do, and you'll be much happier. And I was like, you're really right. And through meeting so many of our awesome top tier impact members and seeing what they're doing, I thought that there was a need for creating this foundational brand work with the impact brands that I really believe in. So I ended up launching my own practice through meeting, clients and really getting myself out there in the impact space from my own apartment in Williamsburg, so it was a very interesting way to kind of like build the plane while I was landing it. Cause it wasn't like I was like, okay, I'm going to leave the ad agency and become, a consultant. It was more like, oh, I have to just like figure this all out. But I felt really, honestly, I don't know how woo-woo we get on this podcast, but I felt very universally supported in doing it. And I felt like it was probably what I was meant to be doing, because I was just super aligned and like lit up when people would tell me about, how they were sequestering carbon, or how they had a paint that would like suck the carbon out of the air, and like actually creating brands that are fixing the planet and a lot of the problems that we have, rather than just like, how can we, increase our profit margins.
Hey there. Are you building a ClimateTech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the ClimateTech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, I think there's so many interesting things you've mentioned there. I really like the journey. I like the fact that you just realized that you had to do it. And I think that the idea of one thing that stands out the most is when you said that you started to understand it just kind of seemed like it was what you're meant to do. This is something that a lot of people, I think it takes some time to realize and to recognize when they're excited, because a lot of times they don't notice that they're excited about something, but the person they're talking to would notice, right? And unless that person is a mentor or somebody who's close enough to you to say, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? Because you're clearly, lit up about it.
That's a great.
And I think it's very important when you're thinking about, obviously you founded your own kind of agency here, but other people might be considering founding a ClimateTech startup or something, right? It could be, some less sciencey startup as well. It could be something that's a little bit more service oriented or whatnot. And I think that people just need to spend a little bit of time realizing how to kind of pay attention to when they are excited.
That's such a good
Um,
point. And I feel like I have a couple of tips on doing that. Tips with Anna on the podcast. I think a big thing for me is like when I feel energized after a conversation versus when I feel depleted after a conversation.
hmm,
So when I was in advertising, for 10 years, I would leave a lot of meetings, especially with clients from, Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 500 companies, tired, like so exhausted because I felt like I was just like beating, something like to death, unfortunately, like just trying to make a point over and over again and try to sell a creative strategy through or something like that. And it's really exhausting to try to turn like a whole ship around that's not ready to turn, yourself, right? Or with a
yeah.
couple of crew members. But it's much easier when that ship is already kind of like floating in your direction. And I learned that when I was talking to impact founders, they were super excited about the kind of strategy that, we were talking about. They didn't have pushback on every single line about like, no, the period needs to be before this sentence. And like, we need the comma to be here. Like they weren't so granular because they wanted to see what the audience and what like collaboration would bring. So I really feel like, that's just my case, but just notice when you're depleted versus when you're excited. Like just after you have a conversation with someone, am I tired or am I energized? And, that comes with nuance. Like if it's the end of the day and you just had a conversation with like the most exciting person ever, maybe you're still tired, but it's like a different kind of tired. Like it's like a mental kind of like exasperated, like, like that versus like, I'm actually physically tired. I need to rest, So, but to your point, like tuning into yourself more, I think is a big thing we can all do.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's not something we necessarily talk a lot about on the show, but there's a lot of kind of meta things that founders need to do and people need to be aware of, whether you're a founder or working in climate, to kind of keep on track, because it's never easy. There's a lot of work to be done. But obviously, so we've had you on today because we want to talk about your advice to founders and how they can build a brand and some of the tips there. So I guess we'll start with, why is it so important to have a strong brand, especially again in the context of climate founders?
Sure. So I think, one of the most important things that we can do is hone who we are and what we stand for and the energy that we bring to things, right? So making sure that that is succinct and memorable and easy to understand is incredibly important in the climate space, because a lot of people are already kind of turned off by it, right? So depending on what you do, like if you're consumer facing, investor facing, B2B, there's going to be different levels of education that people have when they're getting to know your climate brand, but it can't be boring, you guys. I'm sorry. I love scientists more than anyone else. Like I find them endlessly fascinating, but we have to find a way to synthesize the information and make it memorable, make it kind of stick with us, make it a cultural icon. Climate brands deserve the same or even more attention, sexiness, like excitement around them, because they're the path forward. They're the only way that we're going to stay on this planet. So keeping them kind of in the shadows, keeping them with like very boring branding, keeping it like kind of under the surface of like what people can understand, that's going to be difficult, and that's going to make people less likely to engage with the brand, whatever it does, whatever it may be. So it's important to really understand, tune in to what your target audience wants, who they are, what they're interested in, whether it's investors, again, or B2B, different companies, or the consumer, all of these different target markets are going to be in different stages of their cycle in terms of understanding climate. So I can't just like go out to the American audience and start talking about like carbon sequestration. I can't even say that word at 9 a.m. You know, like they're just not going to know what that is. You have to explain to them how it's going to relate to their lives and the problem that they have, you know, and really like land it in their own hearts and minds so that they can start to get excited about it. So that's why it's really important to have a great climate brand, because we have no other choice other than to make these brands amazing, or else that's it, you know, like time's up. But B, you know, the way to do that is to understand that humans, you know, they're just like you, like they want to get excited about something. They want to have something in their lives that they want to tell their friends about, or that they're proud of to have in their home, or whatever it is. So just adding on that layer of like human excitement and connection and viability and vitality to brands is incredibly important. And I think it's just been missing from this sector for a long time, maybe because people haven't been paying attention, maybe because the oil lobby has been like stomping on them, you know, whatever it is. But it's time for that to stop. And it's really time for climate brands to like be the brands of the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is that you have, you know, on a meta level, we've seen a lot of founders come on because they were, you know, very motivated by something that happened in the climate, and then they happen to be an engineer of some sort or a technical scientist, and they go and found a company that solves this one particular climate problem, right?
Sure.
But the thing that we've talked about this before is that they're usually the words they use to tell it, like it has nothing to do with the average person. The average person is like, I do not care. Like I have no idea what you're talking about. If you talk about it in the terms of, you know, the climate problem and people who have experienced that stuff, then it makes a difference. But where I come from in Wisconsin, people aren't really too concerned about climate because the weather is always crazy in Wisconsin all the time. Like if
Sure. Well, because
there's
of
a
the global warming thing too. They're like, it's cold out here. So what are you talking about? Yeah.
Exactly. Because growing up, it was always, oh, it's global warming. They'll say, well, I could use some global warming. It'd be better for my crops. You know, like the point is, it's just just a particular location in the U.S., but it's just a different way of looking at things, right? And people need to understand, why is it valuable to me, right? I have this discussion with my dad all the time. Why don't you have a Tesla, right? A Tesla you drive like 100 miles round trip 6 times a week, right? You
Mhm.
should definitely have a Tesla because you'd save so much money on
Really.
fuel, and just helping people understand these things. So this is the big question I want to get to you next is, you mentioned in there that you have to help companies identify their audience.
Yeah.
How do you, when your audience is let's say just a group of people like I'm talking about, not necessarily interested in solving climate, how do you get them to buy into this, especially if we're talking about consumers, right?
Sure.
How do you get them interested when they're,
Sure.
you know, you're a climate company, you're solving a climate problem, but the people you're selling to aren't necessarily, they don't really care?
It's a great question. And it really comes down to understanding them, right? Like your example with the engineer, I see that a lot. You know, people can write code and even their product can be totally amazing and actually really needed and helpful. But they just, you know, it's like trying to cut your own hair. Like you can't brand the company if you're not a brander, you know, a brand strategist, like a storyteller. You can cut your own hair. Like I physically have scissors, I could do it, but I probably shouldn't. You know, that's kind of what I tell people. I think to answer your question a little bit deeper, I'll give you an example of a company that I worked with called Reboot the Future. They're out of London. It's a nonprofit. And they were working on a campaign in Antarctica. And the trouble was nobody gave a fuck about Antarctica because they don't live there. The very few people, I don't think anyone lives in Antarctica, you know? So how can we get people to care about what's happening in Antarctica where we're sitting here today? You know, in their case, it was the UK, but they have a global campaign. So anywhere, you know? And, you know, when we started to unpack that, the thing is, the land that you're sitting on here is the same essentially as the land in Antarctica, as the land in, you know, China or Zimbabwe or anywhere else in the world for the people who are there as well, you know? So we have to understand that like our piece of land is as important as a piece of land all around the world. but we're just not physically there. So how can we like connect those boundaries and see that those boundaries are actually not real? They're just perceived.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show.
And then what happens in Antarctica, if the whole thing melts, that's really going to affect where you're sitting for sure, because sea levels are going to rise, temperatures are going to rise, so many different things are going to happen. So we really had to make people understand that there's a symbiotic relationship happening in every single piece of land all around the world, and we had this really fun campaign where people wrote in and said, what do you love about where you live? And people were writing, I love how, the birds chirp in the morning. I love the cherry blossoms. I love, I live in New York City, just like you. So I have many things that I love about this city. And there's actually really fun nature that happens here too. So, to think about that and tune in, and then you're able to see this huge directory of what everybody loves about their piece of land all around the world. And that really makes you feel a certain way, and that's why traveling is so important too, so that you can really see the experience outside of like your little bubble and really connect this to each other. So that's just an example, but the way to understand your target audience is to think about what they're going through, talk to them, do focus groups, do qualitative research, quantitative research. That's a lot of what I do as a strategist, and really hone in on some insights about what they're going through, and then speak to them in a way that's going to make sense to their human experience, instead of trying to like force something down their throats that they might not even know about, And there's an additional layer to the climate brand that is education. Often some of the brands have an educational component that, the audience might not know that they want or need. Whereas if I'm selling like a ballpoint pen, people probably understand like what the point of that pen is, right? But if I'm selling, a nut milk with an alternative kind of nut from Africa, like Bam Nut, which is a brand that I worked with yesterday from What If Foods, people just don't necessarily know why that's beneficial. So we're going to have to use an educational component to that. And when I say educational component, I don't mean like everybody has to sit around and like grab a textbook and like listen to lectures. We can find a fun way to portray that information, whether it's through video or song or audio. We can really get creative to find out how we can communicate the information that they need to know. But first, we need to distill that information down from the pages and pages of science that are probably behind this climate brand. And like, what are the most important things here, and how can we synthesize them in a way that people are going to understand, and again, that's a lot of what I do as a strategist, is sit with the scientists, sit with the people behind the work, and listen to what they like, see what they're excited about. Like, we did this experiment and these are the results that we got, and we've never seen these results before, and it's super exciting. How can we communicate those results and the benefit that they're going to have to the end user?
Yeah, that high level overview seems definitely really reasonable, given that that's sort of the challenge with climate as a whole. Is it's not really software innovations or application software innovations all the time. It's a lot of things that genuinely move the needle forward, but in a way that people can't really understand. I'm wondering, especially in your experience, you probably have come across a couple patterns or things that consumers, innovators, people who are trying to spread the message, common difficulties that they come across in terms of their branding and their messaging. Is there a toolkit, or are there some general categories in which you face ignorance, resistance, a lack of knowledge?
That's an interesting question. I feel like it definitely differs from company to company, but so I think something that I see a lot is just a little bit of like not being clear about who we are, what we stand for, who we're talking to, and that's what the brand foundational work is all about. We talk about mission, we talk about brand pillars, we talk about tone of voice, we talk about point of view, the brand's point of view. I bring in a lot of Jungian archetypal work so that we can figure out which of these archetypes, and usually I blend two together. Is this brand going to be, so that the audience already has kind of a feeling of who you're showing up as, instead of being something totally new. So he is like a great example of like a hero archetype, and they really lean into that. So finding what archetype you are is really helpful, because then you feel familiar to the audience that you're introducing yourself to, instead of just like, this is us, you have to accept us, like, that kind of thing. So really taking the time to distill down the core foundation of like what this brand stands for, to build that foundational work so that you can build on top of it. I always tell people, we have to lay the foundation down before we can build buildings and houses and a beautiful brand on top of that, or else it's just going to fall into a hole. We have to be really like foundational about just why we're here, and how we can simply communicate that. And sometimes with climate brands and, esoteric brands and things like that, it's not as simple as, the Nikes and the Apples of the world. And that's even more why it's important to do that work, so that we can find the right way to communicate that, because, that's going to be the main way that the idea is going to spread and scale.
Totally. And I think you mentioned something that I find really interesting, which is, the idea of an archetype, right? And I think that it's actually much more innovative in terms of how you classify people, because the questions everyone's asking is, how do I do it? What does it look like? Essentially, people want to understand what it means. And I think that's what an archetype does really well, is it sort of synthesizes some of the key characteristics. So I wanted to know from your perspective, if you think there are general categories of archetypes or ways or commonalities that you're seeing archetypes getting formed in climate.
It's interesting. I feel like the framework that I use is often the Jungian framework of the archetypes that he already kind of laid out for us. And then using them in branding kind of helps us connect brand personalities to larger archetypes. So reinventing the literal wheel of archetypes is, I think, a problem that climate brands have, because it's important to understand that, like, even though you're working in climate and you're saving the world, you're still part of the collective consciousness. Like, you still have to find a way to connect to what people already see and feel and hear every day. So there's definitely some similarities in personalities and in archetypes, but it's important to kind of like go back to the building blocks of psychology that we already have, and think about how can we use these tools to really emerge in an exciting and powerful way.
So that's very fascinating. I think I'm sure you have some guides on this, and people can reach out to learn more in detail
Sure.
about that. I do want to continue on. We've got a lot of things to go through. In terms of when we talked about the science people earlier, right? The engineers building and solving a technical solution, right?
Yeah.
When they're getting started and building their company, usually it's, again, they're in the lab in a lot of cases, especially if you're not doing something that's especially if you're doing something that's deep science, right? Deep tech.
Mm-hmm.
When should they step back and really think about brand? Because they first have to some extent figure out the technology, right? But at some point, when should they step back? And I ask this because we've had many people on the show whose names are completely unrelated to what they're doing today, because they came up with a name when they were, it was an idea in the lab
Yeah, I see
and they
that
were
a lot.
solving a different solution or whatever, or they do a rebrand later on. But I'm just curious because obviously you got to have a name to get going. It's my opinion, right? Anything I've ever done, you got to have some kind of idea. But when should people step back and really, really say, okay, this is where we have to solidify everything from this point forward, because otherwise it's going to be a mess.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, obviously, I want to say bring in a strategist like day one, but I know that that's not possible for a lot of people. But I do think as early as you can is best. And probably if I had to choose like the timeline point, probably at the point of when you're starting to scale. So let's say you have a core team of 3 or 4 people, including the scientist, maybe the CEO, business person, that kind of thing. And you're working on, what we're going to do, what we're going to create, what problem we're going to solve, all of those kinds of things. But as soon as you start to step out to communicating that to the world, that's the time where you need to start thinking about your brand, because that is the time when the brand is going to be useful, And I see it a lot where I'll talk to brands that are in their like Series C stage, and they have a logo that one of the founders drew on a napkin and like somehow made in Microsoft Word, and they're still using that, and that's a little bit of a problem, because that is going to make you not look as professional or as capable as you are, right? So just like brands are like people, Silas. Like I always tell everyone, like brands are exactly like people. So if you as a person want to go out and get this amazing job, you're probably not going to go in like your sweatpants that you've been sitting in for like 5 days and like not brush your hair, right? I mean, you could, and people do in Silicon Valley, Mazel Tov, I'm sure it works for them. But usually here in New York, and just like when you want to present yourself well, you're going to think about what you want to do in order to present yourself the way that you want to be seen and portrayed. And obviously, with people, it's a little bit different. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think it's a good example to think about, that's the same thing as your brand. Like, and in order to get that done well, you need to have a sounding board of somebody who's going to be able to like put you into the kind of the cultural zeitgeist of what's happening, right? Because a lot of founders, their branding that they come up with themselves looks exactly like a different brand that maybe they just didn't know about in a different sector or different category. So it's just really important to do that work and make sure that you're standing out and presenting yourself well if you're going to go step out into the world and, ask for capital, try to hire employees, like try to get into stores and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a nice segue. You mentioned it, getting capital. So I want to talk about this. What are your tips as companies are going through the fundraise, right? Especially let's just assume it's a company who's kind of got the basic technology figured out. They're going to a Series A, and looking to do a pilot and go from there. What are the tips around, how do they approach funds? Anything about the pitch deck? Whatever your major pointers are.
I think the first thing is just, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, is like make sure that you're clear and succinct. Like a lot of the times I see founders say what they're going to say, like kind of their pitch in 5 different ways, depending on, which side of the bed they woke up that morning. So getting it clear and being kind of practicing which words work best, which emphasis works best where, taking the time to really comb through and make sure that the point that you're making is coming across well. I think that's really a key point. And then secondly, before you go and sit in front of the venture capital firm that you're, really wanting to invest in you, I would practice in front of the industry. Ask some folks who know what they're talking about to give you some feedback. And that can be the most helpful thing. And sometimes it's hard to ask for that feedback, because we don't want to be told like, you need to go back to square one, or, we've done so much work. So I can totally understand why it would be scary to do that, but it's so important. And in those moments of getting that feedback back, you're going to get those gold nuggets, because you as a company, even if it's not just you as a solo founder, you have a team, you only know what you don't have the mirrors to be able to kind of see all around you. So you have to get as much kind of reflection and feedback as you can before you go out and ask for capital, because that's the kind of questions that you're going to face at that tribunal, right? You're going to have to be able to answer questions about the 360-degree value of your brand, about your, financial trajectory and things like that. So making sure that you're kind of fully flushed out, I think is really important. I think there's like an old adage that says lawyers, when they're on trial, they never answer a question that they don't know the answer to already, that they didn't know was coming, So I think that that's a good way to think about it. Like make sure you've already thought everything through that they're going to throw at you, and don't seem like you don't know, or that you're flustered, or that you haven't thought about it before. Like make yourself seem as thought out as you are, because this is like you're birthing this thing out into the world, and you're so proud of it, and it deserves to have that level of reflection and confidence to go out into the world and solve these problems, and climate, it's so personal to so many people, and I think starting at, it's starting from that place of story, like this is why this has affected me, but also then taking it past the, this is why I was motivated, into the, this is the work that I've done, and really showcasing that. I think that passion plus purpose really goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is quite interesting. The having really true clarity on what you do. I think it can be difficult for the founders because a lot of times, they get to a point where they're in the work and they need to raise money, and then they just go out and do it, right? We've had one thing that makes me think back is Tommy Leap had said something around making sure you kind of have a map and tiers of who you pitch first, right? Because the first people are, what do you say, friends, fools, and family, I think, right?
Oh, okay.
And people that it doesn't really matter if you mess up the pitch, right? You got to hear the questions and kind of get used to saying it, because
Yeah.
you're right. If you say it differently every time, you have no way of measuring what is the, how am I performing?
Yeah.
So I think that's quite fascinating. And yes, having the clarity and just having somebody grill you like a debate prep or something on what might get
Sure.
asked. Because if they ask a question that's like super obvious and you should have thought of it, you don't have an answer, and it looks pretty bad. But the one last comment I wanted to make would be, when you talk about all these things, it makes me really think just how there's such an inner game of being a founder. There's so many things you have to be aware of with your own like biases and self-conscious, or maybe just overlooking a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be able to not be too attached to your company, your baby, right? It's your idea, but you can't be attached to that idea. You have to be attached to solving the problem and take the feedback. And that's something I notice sometimes people struggle with. So I think those are my comments. Somil, did you have something else you wanted to go into?
Yeah, I think it's also interesting where the balance is between what it's smart for a founder to do on their own versus
Yeah.
getting help.
Well, personal branding for a founder is really important too. Like, just like we do the inner work for the brands, you as a founder should, turn that mirror around and take a look and do some inner work for how you're going to, be reflected and received, and some blind spots that you have, and things like that. I think nobody on this planet walking around, even the Dalai Lama, doesn't have a blind spot, doesn't have something that they can work on. So I think as founders, and that's actually something that I offer as well, is some founder personal branding, to get your own mission clear, to get your own website clear, to get your mission, energized and out and ready for the world. So it's important to do that work too. And I think, there's a lot of coaches out there, and I think that's really great. Like, being able to have somebody who's constantly pushing you forward and has like a big view of the field where you maybe are only stepping on, that's important. So I always kind of recommend different coaches to work with too. So you're right. Like, it is a huge inner game to be a founder, because there's a lot of things that you're swimming against the current of, right? You're kind of like a salmon trying to get to that other side of the river. And there's bears, and there's, a lot of other things. I use a lot of metaphors in my work. And usually they're nature-based. So, it's important to think about how you're going to get from point A to point B, and what your strengths are, but also recognize what your weaknesses are, and honestly, like, talk about that authentically. Like, a lot of people try to pretend like, oh, I'm perfect at everything. Like, don't worry, I have it, but when you say to someone like, I'm actually really not that good at, I'm going to give my own personal example, driving a car. I'm a New Yorker. I just can't really drive a car. Like, I in New York City, in the country, sometimes I'll try, but usually I just outsource that. And I'm kind of afraid. It gives me anxiety. Like, I'm trying, but I'm scared. Like, but see, now everybody's like, I understand. Like, I have a thing like that. I'm like that too. I'm working on it. Yes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I was gonna say I resonate with the nature-based metaphors. I was gonna say, Silas, we should do more of those. I feel like it does give a very environmental ethos to everything you do.
for sure. I noticed someone, I honestly don't remember who it was. I don't think I was connected to them. It was like a share on LinkedIn. But I remember that it was a Ukrainian woman, because I'm from Ukraine, and it really resonated with me. After some of the horrible stuff that's been happening there, she's like, I noticed that a lot of our corporate language is war language, like kill it, slay, things like that. And I even noticed it in myself since she pointed that out. I was like, oh, wow, I do that, and I've been consciously trying to reprogram that into more nature-based things, like kill two birds with one stone. Like, why can't we save two birds with one stone?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this was something that came up in conversation for me recently. There's like a huge fascination between business school and war. Like
Definitely.
going down the foxhole, just like a bunch of different,
The trenches, totally,
exactly.
100%. Yeah,
There's
why?
a huge trend right now, again, blowing up on Twitter and TikTok about people asking their husbands, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? So this is all very topical.
That's a great question. Well, I was in Rome recently, so I feel like it's like more recent than most. And me and my partner, we went to the Colosseum, and it's just so interesting. It's like a huge, amazing monument to war in a way, but like small war that you can like create. And like I was like, what would it be like to walk in here, be wearing like that whole garb and just watch some man like wrestle a lion? Like, it's totally insane that was the thing that happened. you know
Um,
so our,
definitely.
our society has a lot of war kind of like holding it up in high esteem, and I think we need to start putting peace up on that pedestal instead.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's the same way that video games kind of change the way that we process and perceive certain life events. I think,
Okay, we started.
yeah. So no, I think that there's validity to all of it. I feel like part of it too is it's just easier to understand and relate to like the severity of things when you liken it to, but is that appropriate? I think that's up to people's discretion.
100%. And we take it so easily. Like, we take, the whole video game thing of like, I'm in a car and I'm running people over, and then I grab a gun and I'm shooting everyone. Like, if you're doing that for 15 hours a day and then you just like walk outside, like, what is your brain going to be programmed to do? And we have a TTI member actually who's working on kind of a more conscious video game way of being, because there's nothing wrong with gaming, but I do think there's something that is not right about just putting war on a pedestal,
Yeah,
fetishizing. Yeah.
definitely. Well, I don't want to bore the audience too much with our personal views, but I'm sure, again, we'll love to keep talking about this. I think something you mentioned that is definitely worth following up on is I feel like there's a lot of content out there, a lot of information out there about how to work on your brand, how to build it. But I think there's real value in understanding when do you need help and
Mm-hmm.
when do you need another voice. That's something that I think as, people who are first-time founders go through their journey, or even, professionals who have been in the game for some time, it's
Sure.
understanding when do you need help, when do you need to buy a new piece of software, when do you need to bring in some sort of specialized talent to
Mm-hmm.
make it easier on yourself. I don't think that distinction is as clear based on what's out there. So in your experience, I think this is, similar to make another non-climate analogy, similar to bodybuilding. People
Mm-hmm.
hit a plateau. That's generally when you get a bodybuilding trainer because they
Mm-hmm.
help you, even though you've been successful enough to get to a certain
Sure.
point, there is a next level to get to. So I'm wondering in terms of branding, does that exist? And what usually, if there is a commonality, is that plateau?
That's a really interesting question. Um, it probably has to do with when your business is starting to scale, right? So maybe if you, let's say, are a baker, you're able to sell your cupcakes to your neighbors, your neighborhood, maybe even your town. You're going to events, you're at the town meetings, things like that. But if you want to start getting to the next town or the next state or national distribution, you're probably going to need a partner who's going to help you do that, right? So I think it depends on what your vision is and what your goals are, and then being able to recognize that you can't do it alone. A big part of climate is recognizing that we can't do it alone. Not one person can fix the whole climate crisis or deny the whole climate crisis. I think we all have to realize, like, we have our special talents that we have, and turning them on towards climate and really connecting with each other. How can we fix this problem together, and that's what I really want to do with my branding work. Is there's so many amazing ideas out there and they deserve to be seen and heard. Let's make sure that they're as loud as they can be so that we can really start fixing this problem. So to answer your question, I think it's really about how big you want to get and what your goals are, and then like laying out that trajectory, and recognizing that, to go from A to B, I'm going to need a little help here.
Well, I want to double click on the scaling part. I mean, scaling, you can scale at many different stages, going from, first 1 to 100 followers, 500 to 1,000. It could be from first, one customer to 5. What
Sure.
part of, like, what stage of scaling do you see the greatest need or the greatest sort of like turning point?
When you're not able to personally respond to everybody. I think when when people are messaging you and you have like 5 people messaging you and you are able to like have a personal conversation with all those 5 people, that's great. And then you're owning your brand, right? Because nobody else is taking that out of your hands. You're the one that's dealing with everybody personally, right? But when you're getting like 1,000 messages a day and you just personally don't have the time to answer all those messages, that's when it's time to get some help and start scaling. So, and that relates to any type of industry. And I actually experienced that with my first company at Second House. As soon as I stepped away, took a vacation, whatever it is, the message wasn't honed and the experience wasn't the same as I would have curated it. And I was like, oh no, like this is not the way that I wanted this person who I had invited to experience this, curated product that I've been creating, So when you personally as the founder are breathing life into it all the time, and then when you step away, if that whole thing is going to crumble, you need a little bit of help. And you need also, I think, a big skill that not just founders, but a lot of folks who are out there working on teams have, is start learning how to delegate and start learning how to trust people, and also how to brief them. A big part of strategy and branding is that briefing part. Like, I need this, and this, and I want it to feel like this, and this, and make sure that the person who's taking care of it has a clear idea of what you're looking for, so that you can kind of step away with trust instead of step away with anxiety.
I was gonna say that's a very tangible metric. Silas, I feel like we're already sort of hitting the point where we're getting a little overwhelmed with having to engage. So maybe we're at that point too. But I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
It comes sooner
That
than you think, but it's tough because like money is a factor, right? So there's always like this whole scale with like the economics of your company versus like what you actually need and help. And that's like a personal journey that everybody goes through. Like, what am I willing to invest in it? Who's willing to help me? All of the different networking things that you have available to you, which is why networks like TTI are so important, because we all really want to help each other impact the next paradigm, And I really believe that once we align that purpose with the economics as the fuel of it, that's what's really going to make people feel motivated to make change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a certain catalyst that comes, right? We're running out of time, but I want to go over one thing, just kind of I want to give some sense from my side, 2 cents from my side, and then hear kind of your thoughts on this. Is, being a recruiter, there's a lot of times where hiring managers, especially at an early stage, they kind of underestimate the impact of how they manage their hiring process,
Mm,
how it will affect their brand in the public, because they can have like a great leader who's out there speaking publicly,
yeah.
doing great things and attracting people. But I've seen some companies I've worked with in the past that have really terrible hiring processes, where it takes, it stops and goes, and then it eventually does go forward, and they try to, bring the candidates back in, but then they're like, well, I mean, it's been like 6-7 weeks now. Like, are they actually serious, etc. Even though the people may be great and the company may be great, it can really affect the brand. And there's another kind of second part of that, which is how you treat your team, right? If you treat your
Mm,
team in a way that is, not, let's go back to this nature thing. It's not nature oriented, right? If it's really rough or inconsiderate, you're going to develop a reputation in the market, because people speak a lot, right? Word
100%.
travels very quickly, and in particular for the companies that are startups that eventually transition into being a little bit less startupy, they need to be willing to take feedback from their employees, because they can't expect that every person that joins is willing to work 100 hours a week for no benefits, right? So I'm just kind of curious if you have any comments around this brand aspect from
Yeah.
an internal and an external perspective, because we see lots of climate tech companies that are starting to succeed, and then even some of them are doing big layoffs, which I don't think is responsible growth if they're doing that. But can you just talk about this from the hiring perspective slash the internal and external perspective?
Sure, sure. I mean, I think that's why that brand inner work at the beginning is so important, because who you say you are to people who should be who you really are on the inside. Again, it's like people. If I'm out here spreading like flowers and love, and then at home I'm doing something like horrible and inconsistent with that vision that I'm trying to put out there, that's not a holistic person. And brands need to be like that too. So as you're creating your brand, as you're thinking about who we want to be to audiences, that's who you have to be internally as well. Even more so, you have to really be that mission, embody that mission, and see how it's going to shape itself out to be in the hiring process, in the interview process, in your HR policies. If we say we're a nature-based solution and we don't have any benefits for our employees, like that doesn't really make a ton of sense. But maybe you can help them find like holistic practitioners and help them get, acupuncture and things like that. If you're selling a holistic practice, that's really beautiful. So making sure that those through lines are happening externally, internally, and presently with yourself, so that we're being honest, like I actually am this kind of a brand and I'm embodying it in all of the different practices that I do. I too find that, in job processes in the past, it can be super brutal to, get ghosted and try to do a whole presentation for someone and never hear back. And like the whole hiring process can be super brutal. And I'm sure you see a lot of that. And that's another thing that we have to disrupt, because these are humans that we're talking about. But you as a company, I think before you start hiring, you should take some time to think about, how do we want to hire? How do we want this process to look like? Who is going to do this work? And sometimes startups, and I see this with my clients too, like things are moving a million miles a minute and the founder is like super busy, and investors are calling and this is happening and we need an event for Climate Week and like this and that. Like so many things get thrown at you. And it can be really hard to manage the kind of empatheticness of holding your team and everything like that. But that's why you need the right people to be able to do that. It's not on one person. You really need to just understand that these are people that we're dealing with, and we want to be able to approach them with the way that we would want to approach the people who are giving us money too. It's kind of it's the same polarity of I'm attracting customers and I'm retaining talent. It's really two sides of the same coin. And you have to treat those who work for you even better than those who are, buying from you, because then everybody inside the company feels that too. And then that magnetism is going to translate to your audiences.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things that I'll wrap up with. I think one is the communication part, right? Candidates understand that life happens and things happen, but what they don't get, and they will never be willing to accept, is that you can't tell them what's going on, right? Like, I get it if you're busy. I get it if you've got, a huge deadline or something, but just communicate it to me, right? And that's what we try to do on the recruitment side, not to, talk my own book too much, but we try to play that middle person role of helping them understand, hey, we apologize for the time delay. But also, if you're doing this on your own, if you're a founder, make sure you think ahead the next 6 weeks. A lot of people think that you can go out and hire in 2-3 weeks and you're going to have somebody in your place. You're not. It's going to take usually 6 to 8 weeks, no matter what kind of company you are. There's some roles that are quicker, but for really critical roles, it's going to take a while. So think ahead and be aware of Climate Week's coming up. I will not respond to any of your emails during that time. Like, give me until this time to get back. Give them a heads up, because if you don't communicate, it's really a bad look.
It's like people. I always say, like, if I'm holding all of these secrets inside, that's going to hurt me and the people that I'm having relationships with. Just be honest. And also, like, if you can't make something, be honest about that too. Like try to keep your word about things like that as well, you know, because it can be really hard when schedules get busy and then a candidate is waiting for you to show up, or, you know, a meeting doesn't happen or things like that. And even if you're a little late, you know, things can get rejiggered, things can get rescheduled, but just be honest. Like, I think we need just more honesty and communication. More communication is always better than less, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that this point that I find really fascinating is, you know, I watch it all the time with candidates being on the outside, right? I have to convince them to take the interview with my, you know, my client. I get them interested, and then eventually they go inside, right? And then I'm like, okay, now do they still feel the same way, right? Because they were on the outside of the house looking at the nice painting and everything, right? Now is the
Yeah,
inside as nice, right?
right.
And this is something that is very, it manifests itself very quickly. People, you know, there's a kind of this transition when they've accepted the job and they begin to go in. There's things that are, you know, oftentimes there's some of my clients that I've worked with in the past who it feels like there's a bit of a transition to the reality versus the, you know,
Hmm.
the campaign.
We love
But
it.
my favorite clients are the ones where there is no difference. Everything is the same through all the way, and the candidates appreciate that because they know exactly what they were sold and they join. So I think this whole branding thing, if you're slow responding to your internal candidates and people you want to join your team, like how are you going to treat customers, et cetera, right?
That's so true. That's
And
so true.
the talent market for a lot of people is extremely tight right now. So you need to be aware of how you do this, because I have seen companies completely tank their brand just by having bad hiring processes or treating their employees wrong. But anyways, not to talk my own book too much. I think we've talked
It's
about a
all
lot of things.
brands are everything. Like they're everything in how you live and breathe, how you hire, how you decorate, how you know, show up at Climate Week, how you do anything. You know, so I think it's really important to think about yourself as a whole. You know, I always say brands can be like the sun. You know, it's like an energy source, like a hopefully never ending energy source that like keeps burning and burning and burning. And it's a 360-degree energy source, right? But if I'm in New York, the sun is going to feel the same to me as what on the other side of the world too. I mean, depending on the equator and things like that. But the energy source is the same. So it's important to be seen as that same energy source from any way that somebody is looking at you, whether it's through your advertising campaign, through your hiring process, through your swag, like through your events. I see a lot of climate brands and they have events with plastic cups that go straight in the trash.
Yeah, I thought about this recently. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. It's not adding up. One plus
And
one does not equal two.
I recently met a company, I'm going to do a little plug for them, called called Zero Cup. And what they do is they drop off as many cups as you need, and then they pick them up at the end. You know, and it's a circularity game, and they have plates also, and it's like a really great one-stop solution. The founder, Michael, he's really great. He's New York based. And I just found the solution for an event that I had yesterday. And I was like, oh my God, can you please come? Because I don't know what we're going to do with these cups.
Yeah.
And we had a caterer also. And she was like, well, I could bring glass cups. But that's a whole thing as well. It's like a weight, you have to wash them. Like that's difficult too. They can break, you know, so and especially if you're having an event, you know, outside or at scale, it can be
Yeah.
hard to bring glass. But at the same time, plastic is horrible, and we know that it's ruining our earth, and it's made out of petroleum, and I could go on and on. So what's the kind of middle ground? Just look for solutions and make sure that you're not just playing the status quo because it's easy. I don't want to see any fake plants at climate events, like plastic plants. That really grinds my gears. Either don't have any plants or get a real plant.
Yeah, 100%. There's so many interesting things. It's really been great to have you on. I think we'll have to definitely have a follow-up at some point, but let's you know, what's your call to action? Anything that you can ask of the audience? Where can people reach you?
Sure. So my website is Anna Co. So it's ANNAKO.co. And I'll put that in the show notes for you guys. So, and my email is anna@annaco.co. So that's going to be ANNA@ANNAKO.co. And you can reach me there, and I'd be so happy to hear about the brands that you're building and what you're working on. And I'm actually launching a new offering during Climate Week. I'm launching it during Climate Week, but it's going to be live, you know, hereafter, where I'm doing 60 and 90-minute calls with founders or people who are working on brands to kind of solve one problem. Because I've been hearing a lot of feedback, like I have this one thing and I just really don't know how to solve it, or is this name right, or what should I do about this? And it's really great to have a sounding board on that. So that service is on my website too. Again, annako.co. And I'd be so happy to just like listen and see what's going on and how we can help. And again, like it just really lean into empathy and connection and all those kinds of things, because the climate crisis, it got created because of a lack of that. And we can't keep perpetuating that with the same energy that built it, right? So we have to really start breaking apart all of these problems and filling them with solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. So definitely reach out and, get your branding right, everybody.
Definitely. So nice to talk to you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.